With the 2016 presidential campaign in full swing, have you ever sat back and wondered how this whole process works? What is the Iowa caucus? What is the difference between the primary and the general election? What is the conventions? We know we have. In this speech, we will answer most of your questions about the presidents are elected. It is important to have a general understanding of the requirements of becoming a president and understanding the importance of the responsibilities this individual has. The President of the United States of America is the Commander-in-Chief in the United States Armed Forces. To become the President of the United States, one must be 35 years old, a resident for 14 years, and a natural-born citizen. The President of the United States has a 4-year term. They can only do 2 terms, with a salary of $400,000 annually. The President is in charge of the executive branch and is responsible for enforcing all laws passed by Congress. To accurately do this, the President nominates members of the Cabinet who advise the President on policy matters. The President is in charge of appointing over 2,000 federal positions that the Senate has to consent to. However, the President also has the ability to take those positions away from those appointed. Contrary to many beliefs, the President is not as powerful as many would think. There are always the ability to impeach. To impeach means that they will officially be removed from office. The right to impeach all public officials is in the Constitution in Article 1. The President, Vice President, and all civil officers of the United States shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. Removing an official takes 2 steps. A formal accusation from the House of Representatives. This is a majority vote from the House. And trial and conviction by the Senate, which is 2/3 vote from the Senate. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is in charge of the proceedings during the impeachment process for the President instead of the Vice President, because the Vice President is next in line for the presidential position. In 1868, Andrew Johnson, our 17th President, was impeached for violating the Tenure of Office Act. Later, he was acquitted by the Senate. In 1999, Bill Clinton, our 42nd President, was impeached for perjury and obstruction of justice. He was also later acquitted by the Senate. The impeachment process of Richard Nixon, our 37th President, was unsuccessful because he resigned from the office before the vote. To date, no U.S. President has been removed from office from impeachment and conviction. I'm going to let Morton take it away, explaining the primary season.
Thank you, Alex. Now it's important to understand how the Democratic and Republican parties formally select their presidential nominees. And that will be, then they will compete for presidency. This is first done in the caucus and the primaries. The presidential primary elections and the caucuses are held in the U.S. Dude, sorry guys, I'm having massive technical issues. Can we restart? Just keep going? Alright. Alright, so the presidential primary elections and the caucuses held in each U.S. state is part of the nomination process of the presidential elections. The purpose of the caucus and the primary elections is to involve the public in narrowing down the candidates for both political parties before the general election. The caucuses and the primary elections each have different goals, and it will depend on each state of how the process of voting is used. The caucus are held in the form of meetings, and this is organized and run by the political parties. And the primary is different as they are private voting and is statewide and run by the government. The Iowa caucus is the first race in the nominating season. Then follows the New Hampshire caucus. The caucus is demonstrated differently between the Democratic and Republican parties. The process of the Democratic caucus allows representatives for each candidate to give talks to rally the support of the people. Then, people pick which candidate they vote for by sitting in the designated sections in the room. The people are then counted up and delegates are distributed proportionally to the percent of support for each candidate. The Republican caucus is much simpler and just involves private voting, and the votes are tallied up and delegates are then distributed proportionally. Delegates are individuals chosen to represent their state at their party conventions prior to the presidential election. The delegates play a very important role in the caucus because here is where the delegates pledge their support to a specific candidate. And this is important because these delegates go on to the next stage of nomination, to then attend the county conventions, the state, and then the national conventions. The primary, as I said before, is a statewide and government run, and this is different as it used secret ballots as a way of voting. More and more states are starting to use the primary elections over holding caucuses. There are several different kinds of elections in the primary, such as open and closed primaries. In an open primary, unaffiliated voters, meaning you are independent and not registered as a Republican or a Democrat, can vote. But if it is a closed primary, only registered party voters can participate. Primary elections are the main way for voters to choose a nominee. Voters go to the poll, cast their votes for the presidential candidate or the delegates, who will then represent the candidate at the party convention. The nominated party candidates selected in the primary election then run against each other in the general election. After the caucus and the primary elections are held, the selection of a nominee will go in the hands of the delegates, and this is done through conventions. The conventions have evolved over time and were not originally part of the Constitution. Previously, nomination was done in secret caucuses by members of Congress. From the 1820s until the 1930s, party conventions were lively events which used to be the primary way of determining a nominee, which was often done through much debate. By the mid-20th century, however, primary elections had become the main way of selecting a nominee, and citizens became directly involved in the voting process. The first and foremost goal of political conventions is to nominate a party's candidate for president and vice president. The national party conventions bring together party members in support of the party's platforms and nominees, and thousands of delegates gather to nominate candidates for the president and the vice president. Now, I'm going to hand it off to Rachel, who will begin to explain the next steps in electing a president through the election campaign.
Thank you, Morden. Now, let me pull this up, just kidding. Perfect. Now, after the delegates are chosen for each party, they will continue to campaign to decide who will become our next president. The general election campaigns, they tend to focus their efforts more on the swing states, or the states in which there is no clear Democrat or Republican majority, because the state electoral college electors are chosen on winner takes all. So, for example, Idaho is a very Republican state, so the delegates tend not to, or the Democratic delegates tend not to visit Idaho because they know for the good majority they will vote Republican. Now their trek begins about the end of June, and it'll continue until the beginning of November, which brings us to the election day, which is November 8th, 2016. On which all of the votes will be counted, and we will have our new President of the United States. Before I get into that, they have to go through something called the Electoral College, which could change the outcome of who becomes president entirely. So how it works is the Electoral College, it's kind of controversial mechanism of the presidential elections, because it was created by the framers of the Constitution as a compromise for the presidential election process. Back then, they were very concerned about the ruler of their country becoming too powerful, like they'd seen in monarchies before, so they wanted to make sure that they had a mechanism that would keep the president from becoming too powerful, so they decided to change the way they vote just a little bit. So at the time, some politicians believed that a purely popular election was just a little too reckless, while others objected to giving Congress the power to select the president. So they came up with this new system called the Electoral College. So who votes and how many votes per state come down to each state, because each state has a number of electors that are equal to the number of its senators plus the number of its representatives. So currently the Electoral College includes 538 electors, 535 for the total number of congressional members, 3 of whom represent Washington, D.C. That was agreed to a long time ago in the Constitution, so they have 3 extra. When the president is elected, it's an indirect vote in which the citizens cast their ballot for a slate of members of the U.S. Electoral College. So these electors, in turn, will directly elect the president and the vice president. And these votes are then sealed and sent to the president of the Senate, who opens and reads the votes on January 6th in the presence of both houses of Congress. The winner is then sworn into office at noon on January 20th. And that's just a little bit more about the Electoral College. But before they can elect a winner, they also have to take... Oh, just kidding. Wrong transition. So to learn more about the inauguration, I'm going to turn it over to John, and he will tell you a little bit more about that.
Thank you, Rachel. Now, after all this process is complete, the president-elect still has a long list of things to do before they officially become president. This is known as the transition of power. During the time between the election day and inauguration day, the president has a long list of things to do. One of the main priorities he has is selecting a cabinet. Cabinets are around 15 people who make up the heads of the executive branch agencies. These people are important because first off, they are nominated by the president and elected by a majority vote in the Senate. They usually go through pretty easily, but sometimes it becomes a more difficult process. Their names are usually leaked before they are voted in by the Senate, so the public and the senators who are voting for them have an idea of what's going on. They also play an important part in what's known as the line of succession. This is what happens if a president is impeached or dies while in office or goes to jail or anything like that. The line of succession usually goes from the president to the vice president to the Speaker of the House to the President pro tem of the Senate. Afterwards, these cabinet members take over, starting off with the Secretary of State, then the Secretary of Treasury, then the Secretary of Defense, and down the line. Also during this time as president-elect, they try to make it so it's smooth and peaceful, that you don't want anything going like a new guy shows up or new woman shows up to be president, and it's their first day on the job. This is all thanks to the 1963 Presidential Transition Act, and they try to make sure everything goes smoothly. It doesn't always happen that way. For example, in 2001, between the term of President Bill Clinton and President George W. Bush, on the first day of the Bush administration, all the W's were removed from White House keyboards. So it might always be a peaceful transition of power, but it's not always a proper one. After the president, when he's also the president-elect, also engages in what's known as security briefings daily between the conventions and the inauguration day. During these highly sensitive, security and intelligence briefings are given so that the president knows all threats, foreign and domestic. These were enacted by Harry S. Truman and are still given today. Inauguration Day starts off for the president, as Rachel mentioned, on January 20th in 2017 this year. It used to be on March 4th every year, but they changed that in 1936. The president-elect's day normally starts off by a meeting with the sitting president at the White House. They have a chat in the Oval Office, and we're really not sure what happens then, but we know it's private and it's meant to stay that way. Afterwards, the president heads to the Capitol where he's going to take the oath of office. After the VP gives his, the president-elect has to give a certain oath with the sitting Supreme Court justice, usually the chief Supreme Court justice. The oath is as follows. I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will do the best of my ability, persevere, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. This oath has to be given verbatim and no mistakes can happen. In 2008, for example, or 2009, President Obama messed it up and was forced to give the oath over again the next day. After giving the speech on the Capitol steps in a huge ceremony that involves millions of people, which is photographed in this slide, the president-elect usually gives a longer speech laying out his vision for the country and what he plans to do for the next 4 years for his term of office. It's really not a political speech, but it usually gives out a framework of what he envisions the country will be after his or her time is done. After the speech is laid over, and after maybe some prayers or some poems, the president-elect then attends a luncheon at the Capitol steps, or in the Capitol, and then proceeds to go to a parade. This parade is a huge affair involving members of the military and people from all 50 states. And then sometimes the president will get out and meet people of the public and shake their hands, but that's usually in a very highly secure area by the Secret Service. That night, the president and first lady then attend numerous balls and functions where they dance, drink, and sing the night away before his or her first day takes over. After all this ceremony, the president's first day in office and his next years in office are very difficult, so it is nice to have a day to relax. So as you can see, the process is a long and difficult one. Becoming the leader of the free world is not easy, but you'll always be remembered throughout history. As of late, some have said the presidency is too big of a job for one man or one woman to do. They may be right. The United States government and its role in the world has expanded to a size and scope the founders would have been amazed by, and who knows what tomorrow will bring. All that is known is that the process takes years to complete, thousands of people, and many man-hours. After what we have shown you today, you might ask yourself, is it worth it? The question is left for you to decide, but we're certain that all former presidents will say it was. Thank you.